are going to be talking about Wrong Turn 2021. This is a kind of quasi-remake of a somewhat classic slasher movie. This one directed by Mike P. Nelson and stars Charlotte Vega, Emma Dumont and Matthew Modine. So this is kind of more of a reimagining than a remake, because it's vastly different from the original movie. I was actually a huge fan of the original Wrong Turn movie. I'm less keen on the sequels. I know they have their fans, but I really didn't like the sequels. I thought they were kind of cheap and samey. And this movie is very, very different in regards to how the story kind of plays out. It's much less a remake than just a kind of a reimagining of that kind of the same basic idea, but significantly different, with different meat on the bones. This is going to be a spoiler review because I have to talk about some of the differences here and certain plot points. So if you haven't seen the movie or you don't want spoilers, then watch this review later on. So the basic broad strokes are the same. It's a group of kids kind of get lost in the woods and end up coming afoul of some people who live in the woods. The basic premise is the same, but there are some significant differences. Firstly, how the circumstances to the group of kids getting lost in the woods is very different. We have different timelines here. We have our earliest sort of timeline is these kind of 6 kids going into the woods. Then we have a little bit 6 weeks later, we have the father, played by Matthew Modine, going into the woods trying to find his daughter. And we have a third time jump towards the end. The main difference, however, is our group of antagonists, these guys that live in the woods, are extremely different. I'm going to refer to them as mountain men because I really don't know what to call them, but they are kind of like a doomsday cult. Now, in the original Wrong Turn movie, it was a family of inbred cannibals that were kind of, through years of inbreeding, were mutants really and had a kind of strong deformities and were cannibals. That is not the case here. In actual fact, we have a very large community, probably around 200 or so people, I would say, of these cultists who have removed themselves from society, live right out in the wilderness because they don't want any part of society. They think the world's going to end, and they kind of want to, just be out away from everything else. They are somewhat civilized compared to the original movie, and they have their own sort of society. They're not cannibals, or at least as far as we know in the movie. Our victims are not hunted for sport or anything like that. Our victims just happen to come across, and there's an encounter that happens where one of our protagonists kills one of the antagonists. Now they believe these mountain men have ill intent towards them, and there is evidence that say that they do, but there's also evidence to say that they don't. In actual fact, the movie goes to great lengths to try and give us some sympathy towards our mountain men characters. So let's talk about what works first of all. I think we have to be honest, and we have to take the Wrong Turn title and put it to one side, because I have seen a lot of criticism where people are moaning because this movie is so different from the original Wrong Turn. Noted, but we have to look at the film that we have and base it on its own qualities rather than it being kind of like projecting basically because it's associated with something else. Let's talk about what works. One of the things I liked about the movie are 5 out of our 6 protagonists are interesting and likeable characters that seem to have realistic relationships with each other. For example, our 2 female characters, they kind of bicker a little bit. They don't seem eye to eye on certain things, but they never out and out fall out. They seem to kind of disagree, but be able to kind of move on with their friendship, which I thought was very mature. Because a lot of these times they'll kind of like be at odds and kind of, you bitch and all of this, and that isn't the case here. I was also glad that we didn't have any goddamn love triangles and things like that kind of going, oh, this guy's having an affair with that girl. None of that, which is always the case in these films. It was refreshing to not see that. I also think our kind of 3 timelines as well was quite good. I quite enjoyed that. It gave it a point of difference. I thought the acting was pretty solid across the movie, for the most part at least. I mean, I do think some of the way the characters were written were a little issues with, but we'll come on to that. And I think there is some fantastic gore. And I love the way that because the main cause of danger for our group, at least initially, is actually traps rather than people, if this makes sense. And there are some brutal kills here involving some traps, and the effects work, the practical makeup, the gore effects look very, very good. On Mountain Men aside, again, I'll just remind you there is going to be spoilers in this review. Were very different because they're a doomsday cult. They're not these cannibals, and there is an attempt here to give them a sympathetic side and show you that, you know, it's not always black and white. And these guys, they just want to be left alone, and they feel that our 6 antagonists have come into their land, ultimately killed one of their kind of people, and they kind of want payback for it. They want justice for their comrade. And it was interesting to see a very different kind of interpretation of these kind of like these mountain men, and I quite like the fact that it was you know, a different sort of society. We see a functioning society that doesn't seem too savage. You know, they seem, you know, at least initially, they sort of seem like they are pretty kind of like civilized, all things considered. I mean, as the movie goes on, we kind of learn that they do have a savage side. But I actually kind of quite like the fact that it's very different. And this is why when people have, say, remakes, people complain when it's kind of like a, you know, a shot-for-shot remake. But when it's wildly different, again, we have people complaining. And I, to be honest with you, would prefer a different take on the story, because I've seen the original Wrong Turn. It hasn't, you know, it hasn't like, it still looks just as good as it did when it was made. So it was an interesting movie, because I feel like I haven't seen this film before. I'm watching something new, even though it's kind of a, you know, I guess a reimagining of the same property. I still feel there was new things to discover for me here. And there are some brutal scenes. We learn later on kind of how these mountain men have dealt with people that have wronged them. And again, it's interesting, although I don't think it makes some sense. We'll come on to that. So let's talk about maybe things what I didn't like. So I like 5 out of the 6 people, but we have that one over-loud, douchey guy that seems to be in every film that is just way over the top. And I think if you were a person that lives in the city, you're going out to the country, how many people are going to be this obnoxious and aggressive to the locals? It just seems so over the top, especially when the other 5 people in the group seem to be perfectly well adjusted. It makes sense that maybe if they're all like that you would associate with people like that, but I don't understand why it just seems so over the top and aggressive. It's just a very typical thing when you get city kids going into the country in these sort of films. There's always that one guy, or you know, at least one guy that wants to be a dick. And I understand they want to ignite the confrontation, but it's just a worn out cliche. So here's my big issue with this film. I think some of the writing here is on the poor side. So this is going to be a little bit in depth now, because I'm going to have to go into the minutiae to really demonstrate this. So before we get into the woods, right, we see, or when we just, before we get into the woods, and even when we're first sort of starting on our adventure into the woods, we see that these mountain men, we'll just call them the mountain men, are stalking our group of kids. But the movie wants us to believe that our kids are ultimately responsible for this, for assuming that one of the guys was killing one of their friends, right? So they do a big thing here of making the point here being that this is the whole reason this conflict exists is because there was a misunderstanding, and our protagonists have killed one of the mountain men, and that is the reason why there is ultimately this big falling out and the conflict. But it doesn't make sense, because that isn't what the movie establishes. Now, we see people stalking our groups before they even come to that point, right? But there's not out and out attack, but they're stalking them. Fair enough. You can just, they're just looking around, right? Great. However, we hear in the movie, it is established in the movie by the kind of the townsfolk who are aware of these mountain people, the foundation they're called. No one, when you go up in these, you cross their foundation, you don't come back. They say this multiple times in the movie. However, in the court scene in the film, where our guys are on trial, and one of the guys has killed one of the foundation guys, and they say, right, the rest of you three, what happens? Did this guy kill one of our guys? And if you lie, there's going to be big trouble. And they're like, yeah, honestly, tell the truth, otherwise you're going to be big trouble. They kind of like dance around it and ultimately lie. And they're like, oh God, now you're in trouble. With the idea being that they were going to poke out their eyes and chuck them in this dark hole, right? So I was thinking, well, what happens if they did tell the truth? What would they have done? Because it's established that no one has come back from crossing the foundation, right? And everyone who seems to have crossed them seems to have their eyes poked out in this dark hole, no matter what they have done. So would their fate have been any different if they had told the truth or not? The movie makes a big point of saying, like, you can, for a morality reason, you could be honest and tell us about what happened and we'll kind of treat you better, maybe let you go. Or you can lie and ultimately get your eyes poked out and chucked in a dark hole. They lie, and that's what's going to happen. That's what they intend to happen. However, I just don't see how it would have been any different had they told the truth, because what we see is everyone else who seems to have gone on there had their eyes poked out and chucked in a hole, including the father later on in the movie when he comes and tries to find a daughter. Doesn't hurt anyone, but that's what happens. Well, that's what they try and do, at least. And then, like I said, the townspeople are saying, oh, no one's come back. So it doesn't make sense. Our leader of our mountain men looks way too groomed. You know, everyone seems too educated. They know how to drive a car. They know how to track someone down. I mean, these guys are living out in the woods without any electricity, anything like that. No modern amenities. Yet they seem completely self-sufficient and be able to find someone in modern day America without any type of, you know, electronic devices or tracking or things like this. They could drive a car. I mean, I guess you could say they've got their ID maybe, but things aren't established. If they find out there is, they need to establish that. If they were going to double cross them and poke their eyes out anyway, it needs to be established. It isn't. It's poor writing. So I think this movie is an entertaining movie in its own right, but I think the writing is poor. I really like the ending, however, I will say, just going back onto a positive. I've always complained when films do the FU moment. At the end of the movie, the killer comes back to life, or, you know, some big like twist right the very dying seconds of the movie. It's what I call the FU moment. This movie actually has a kind of a treble FU moment where there's a quick succession of things that happen at the end. But I've got to say, it actually ended on quite a satisfying note. So I think this movie is enjoyable. I like the fact that it's a different reimagining of a franchise. I think it probably would have been benefited had it not been called Wrong Turn. I think you're just inviting comparisons then. But to be honest, that's not part of my review. I'll park that. I don't care what it's called. I just want to watch the film. But to me, I think this is an enjoyable film, but it's let down by some poor writing. And if these guys were going to just treat themselves anyway, it needs to be established. It wasn't. It's poor writing. So I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. It's an enjoyable film, but it's certainly not a particularly well thought out movie in my opinion. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.